one of their big mistakes, was to kick out the Muslims, but they did. And 70,000 were displaced, mostly on the west coast, but also on the east. And when this happened, the Muslims had no choice but to align themselves with the government. So suddenly, your neighbor was your enemy. And before, they had lived fairly peacefully. So it was a very confused situation. So again, you had over 375,000 people who were already displaced by the conflict. And then most of the dead in the tsunami were in the Tamil territories, partly because of this you already had all of this structural, displacement and destabilization. You had people living in inappropriate sites, in substandard buildings. And what I find interesting about this, I think it's an extreme case, but so much of the damage in natural disasters is happening in places with a lot of political instability. And, years ago when I was working in Bangladesh, people would always map what they call the arc of insecurity, which is from the Himalayas down through the eastern part of India, into Myanmar, into Indonesia. And they said this arc of political insecurity is directly coinciding with this arc of geologic instability. So it's an earthquake zone. And earthquakes bring tsunamis. So anyway, so this is, again, this is partly why I'm interested in all this. The other thing to notice here, which is important, is these are the barrier islands. This is all sand. On this side, the higher elevation is actually river deposits. So it's a different soil type. It's more consolidated. It's higher. It's safer. But all the fishing villages would have been on the other side. So I talked before about how for women, one of the reasons that so many died was because when the men would go out fishing or go to work in the fields, the women would go and take their baths in the ocean. And so they swim fully dressed, whether they're Hindu or Christian or Muslim. The Buddhists, I'm not sure, I don't spend much time there. But they all would have been very heavily clothed. And this was one of the issues. And they would have had their children with them. So the big reasons, again, probably the most important reason that there was so much destruction was actually just being unaware of the situation. They didn't have an early warning system. Many of the countries that were impacted had very inadequate early warning systems. Again, being at home, the bathing, being reluctant to leave the house because they were protectors of the property. Many of the husbands were actually out of the country. Because the other thing that happened, when you couldn't suddenly do business on the North-South Highway, is that you had both men and women, but mostly men, going to Qatar and Saudi for work. So you suddenly had this huge displacement of the male population. You also had very large numbers who emigrated to Europe or Australia or Canada or the US who could afford to leave during the war. So the people who were left behind were the most vulnerable. So the secondary impacts, again, we talked about these the other day, so I'm not going to spend time on them. You can read them later. And then I mentioned all of the gender-based violence. There was a lot of it, and it wasn't just women, as we said before, though it's mostly the women that have been documented because it was the women's groups who were doing the documentation. The government didn't do any of the documentation. And even when the women's groups would collect the stories, it was, whether it was purposefully ignored or whatever, you can't say. But the countries certainly didn't, they wanted outside help, but they knew that the outside was critical of the war, and so a lot of information was kept out of the international media. Then another issue that comes into play, and I'm going to come back to this later, but are the fact that there's a very high literacy rate, and it's a very well-educated population overall. But the war did disrupt all of that. And the universities were often shut down. There were major massacres at the universities, so there was a lot going on. But the other issue that I find really interesting is that families are very worried that if their women or if the girls are overeducated, that they won't be able to attract a husband. So they're almost purposely being kept ignorant, which is a problem, a huge problem. So again, we've talked about this. These are some of the stories. This was the teenage girl who was raped as she was pulled from the waves. So the women's groups then have been, as I said, they were already very well networked and very active already from the 70s on. The war started officially in '83, though there's been conflict in the country from before the British left. And the women's groups range from people who have, or groups of women who have focused on specific communities, like the displaced Muslims. There are some really strong feminists who have founded and led organizations that specifically cater to their needs, which are somewhat different, but somewhat the same. And then there are other women who started organizations that catered to, across all of these boundaries. But all of the women put their lives on the line. And that's really important to understand, is that they both are able to operate across these lines, partly because they're not being taken seriously. And that's one of the dilemmas with any kind of marginalized group, is if they have strength in numbers and in networking, it's often because people aren't really paying attention. And so the minute you start to mainstream them, you may be killing the very thing that's allowing them to be successful. And so, I don't have any answers for that, but it's a reality. But many of these women had to leave the country because their lives were being threatened, so they were actually orchestrating a lot of their activity from afar, and then they would come back when they could. The other thing that they did was they started collecting stories during the war, and they said, if nobody collects these stories, we will have no memory, we will have no long-term memory, and it just allows it all to happen again. So whether it was the conflict or the tsunami or any of the other disasters, and there are many other disasters in Sri Lanka, from the floods and the landslides to the drought. The other thing, and I put in some slides today because of what you were all talking about yesterday. So I was really intrigued that you were talking about theater as a way of communicating, changing behavior and communicating ideas that may be harder to grasp or harder to accept. And theater is very much part of Tamil culture. And both theater and poetry are two of the avenues through which information is disseminated. And so the theater companies were very, very active in trying to bring attention to and to change behavior in the realm of things like gender-based violence. Then I mentioned last time opportunism, and this is a negative opportunism. There are also very positive opportunisms. But many of the displaced persons camps were not as neat and arranged as what you saw yesterday in the simulation. And they actually were very informal. Again, these people were displaced over and over and over again. And so you had no protection. So the women would try to group women who were now widowed and who were trying to take care of children and elderly. So they were trying to create these clusters of women who could support other women. Because if you're living like this, you're very vulnerable. This is off of the topic of gender, but another thing that happened, which I mentioned before, is that where all of these coastal communities were living all around the border of Sri Lanka, when the tsunami hit, and on the western side, what happened with the tsunami wave is that it hit India and bounced back. And that's where the great train accident happened, where 3,500 people were killed on the west coast. So the direct impact was on the east, but there was this backward bounce on the other coast. And but what happened is that the government immediately came in and said it's not safe for anybody to live here. So they displaced all the communities, and then immediately came in and started developing them. And this is what, again, I mentioned Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine. It's what she calls disaster capitalism. And and this was her case study, was what was happening in Sri Lanka. It was one of her case studies. So, it's not safe enough for the people who had a livelihood there to live there, but they're going to appropriate that property and start giving it out to their cronies and to, foreign developers. And the other ironic thing is that they had a female president at the time and a female prime minister, and they're, in terms of gender issues, Chandrika was not there. She was not supporting either the minority groups or the gender issues. So that was kind of a sad thing. And then the other thing that happened with the tsunami, it was mentioned yesterday, is the recruiting of children, be it for the international sex trade or be it in this case for the Tamil Tigers after the tsunami. There were so many orphan children that, again, in terms of opportunism, there was just this rush to get these children. And it was very sad. And the Tigers were known for recruiting child soldiers. And I actually work with one now. She's part of my core team. And she's the one I keep looking at and saying, she has a lot of really important lessons that she could teach other women. And then, I wanted to talk about the two kinds of women that were changing their role in society during all of this. So on the left is the head of the anatomy department at University of Jharkhand. She was murdered by the Tigers. She actually had been an active supporter of the Tigers, but when she saw how they were kind of randomly killing off anybody who criticized them, she became a target. She was part of the University Professors for Human Rights, and she was murdered. But she became kind of a rallying figure in her death for a lot of these women's groups. On the right are the female Tigers, and again, many of them volunteered, but many of them were forced to join. So the Tigers were going after one child per household, and they were, whether they were going after your money or your children, they were quite aggressive in terms of how they did it. But again, these women were moving into roles they had never had in society before. So they developed great physical strength, they developed great strategic ability in the field, they took on leadership roles, and the Tigers, one of the good things they did was that they actively were working to eliminate caste and gender difference and any kind of discrimination. So it was only when the war ended that these women were kind of forced back into their old roles. And anybody who's still living who was a female Tiger is now quite ostracized. So these are the groups, and you can see the most important of the women's groups, and you can see from the timeline when they were starting. So late 70s was really when they began to organize. And each one of them, all except for a few, like the Coalition for the Tsunami Affected Women doesn't exist, but that was made up of other groups. So these groups have lasted for many, many years. And they've had very robust succession plans. So they haven't fallen apart when their leader either died of cancer or whatever. They have been able to maintain themselves. And what they do, this woman, Sunila, was one of the most important leaders. She actually did die very early. And she was also actively supporting gay rights because she was gay, and that, as I said before, is illegal in Sri Lanka. But being a woman again, the one thing about governments that I've noticed in the countries I've worked in is that they're terrified of angry women. And so, and she was an angry woman. And so she could say things that other people couldn't, and which is important. And Surya is one of the groups that I know I've been working with for quite a few years. And they're a very, very powerful group. And again, I know they're linked with women's groups here. I put in this slide because this was one of the most moving experiences I had in the last year. I was working with a group of widows and wives or mothers of the disappeared up in Kilinoche, which had been the Tigers' headquarters. And this one woman came over to me, and they were talking about how they had to band together to not be raped regularly, and to provide some kind of security for each other. And she showed me her phone with this photograph of her son's 8th birthday and her husband, and it looked all quite normal. And I said, that's very nice. And then she said, I photoshopped it on my phone. And she photoshopped, her husband's been gone for 8 years, right after the child was born or right before. And partly as security, in the same way that women in America will wear a wedding ring even though they're not married, just to kind of get the attention off of them. She did this to show that she had an intact family. And I thought, okay, that's a form of resilience. It's actually quite interesting. And the fact that she would go and teach herself, I can't Photoshop on a phone. I mean, I can Photoshop it, not on a phone. And I just thought this was incredible. So I'm always looking for these kind of signs of strength among a population. So these are just some of the issues in terms of natural disasters that are being faced all the time. You're always hearing about the landslides. I actually don't focus on those. I'm on the coast. And then you can see how they've changed in the country, that they're having more impact, they're occurring more frequently. And then the reasons, they're the same reasons you all have. You know, the poor land use of the higher ground, how that's affecting stream and erosion conditions. The fact that something that happens up high is going to affect all the downstream communities. These are the landslides. It's been the tea industry that's destabilized most of these slopes. And this one wiped out this whole side of the mountain. This was only 2 years ago, and wiped out highways, wiped out villages. There's a lot of sand mining, which I'm assuming there is in the Philippines as well. This is a huge problem. The government will come and build a new road. It'll be up on an embankment. The sand thieves will come in at night and take the sand from underneath the lower parts of the embankment, and the road will collapse. The drought, what's interesting is that the drought and the flooding happen in the same area. So this is the Tamil parts of the country, or the dry part of the country, and you go from truly severe droughts where there's just no food, no water, to this. So they're constantly being hit by one or the other. So again, this is what it looks like all around Batiklo every few years. And this is what it looks like on a normal day. So they've started replanting mangroves, both in the lagoons and in the ocean. And they're planting castorina trees on the sandbars. But it's not enough. And so these are some of the issues that the women's groups and my group are now focusing on. And then we talked about the fact that for building construction, and then a number of you were asking about housing and shelter. So I wanted to show you some examples of what have been done in Sri Lanka. This, I think, was probably paid for by the Indian government. And this is fairly standard, it's kind of nondescript. But what I wanted you to notice is that it's always the men who are involved. Either they're being trained to build or no one's being trained to build. And I think this is a problem again, because they're often not the ones who are around when things go wrong. And then this upper one is what the Netherlands offered for post-tsunami housing, which, you know, everybody, all people can do is laugh. They all look like a bunch of teapots. And they don't fit the lifestyle. So that luckily only happened in the Ankara district. And then the lower one is by a world-famous architect, who's actually a very conscientious, very good architect. It's Shigeru Ban from Japan. But this lower image, which you can't see very well, is showing the buildings totally blocked in by concrete blocks. So what happened was that this is a Muslim fishing village, and there is absolutely no consideration being given to that culture. So all the houses were lined up on the main street with their front doors facing the house across the street. Well, that's not how most traditional Muslim societies live. And so that idea of protecting the privacy of the home was really interesting. So when I went there the first time, I thought it was abandoned because everything was blocked in like that. And then I eventually made my way around to the back and realized they had literally blown out the back wall of the house and reconstructed the whole complex, so that they had their courtyard, they had their privacy, nobody was watching them enter and leave, the women were being left alone. And so I was very confused by this, and I thought, okay, is that a success story or is that a failure? Because actually they were able to hack it. And if you're able to hack something, isn't that maybe a good thing? So I don't, again, I have no answers, but I was intrigued. So the question is, what now? And knowing that the disasters are going to continue, you talk about the big one. For them, they're actually, it's fascinating to listen to people where they say, we know there could be another tsunami, but we know it's not going to come for at least 100 years. And I say, well, actually, this is some of the most active plate action on Earth. And in reality, you could have another tsunami tomorrow. So it is a big issue, and one of the things we're trying to do is get people to recognize that whether it's a small disaster or a large disaster, they have to be somehow prepared. I shouldn't talk about this, but I love the image. And Sarala is the head of Surya. And when I've been talking to her about the women's organizations and how they've operated there, I've always been intrigued that they're kind of this hidden network that holds together the rest of society. And so I found this image in one of my classes I was teaching, and I thought, this is perfect. It's describing landform and all the forces that give shape to the earth as these kind of hidden systems out of view. And I thought, this is exactly what's happening in places like this. So I was quite intrigued by that. Just to give you an idea of some of the things they're doing, again, they're the ones publishing books on gender inclusion in policy making, in any kind of planning structures. They're now working to get women into the political sphere, which again has happened. You know, this was I think they had the first female president, but you know, that's always been the other side of the island. And Sri Lanka really is very split between these two populations, or these two, the Sinhalese and the Tamils. Anyway, I'm going to skip this. And then one of the things Sarala talks a lot about is this idea of the tyranny of urgency. You know, when something goes wrong, the fact that the government, again, this is a government that's been very criticized in the international sphere, and they don't want criticism. They have a better president now, but again, it's kind of an ongoing issue. There's quite an authoritarian government. And so everything has to happen quickly. There's a lot of whitewashing. You know, when I first got there, the highways, the railroads, everything was bombed and you couldn't navigate through the road system in the east or the north. And the next time I went, there were all these cute little shops and markets, and the road had new paving, and you went one block back, and everything was still bombed out, and people were living in UNHCR tents. And then, so I mentioned before the collecting of stories. These are some of one thing I should again mention is that the collecting of stories was highly controversial. The women had to keep it hidden, because one thing about Sri Lanka is that many, many, many people disappeared. Human rights lawyers were killed, journalists were killed, they were disappeared. The women who were in leadership roles were always being threatened. I don't actually, other than Rajani, I don't actually know of other women who were killed, but they were always in danger. And so a lot of this was very hidden just until the last few years. It happened all through the war, though. They were collecting these stories. And then I wanted to mention, Adam and I were just talking about this, but this is actually, we started a project there connected to the stories that focused on visual storytelling, because when we started working up in Jaffna and Kilinoche, people were in such trauma. Again, from the tsunami, but more so from the war. And there was a lot of psychological healing that needed to happen, and we had been asked to work with the 90,000 war widows, but it was very hard getting our feet on the ground and understanding how to do that. And so we were showing these women's groups a number of different visual storytelling projects from around the world, which I was familiar with. This one is actually one of my old students who works for an organization in Providence that is focused in Mali, and it's all on public health issues. And they use the traditional clothing, the cloth that forms the clothing for the women, as a way to carry messages about public health. And I find this a really fascinating project. So she came out of our textile design department. And so whether it was Ebola, whether it's HIV, whether it's about pregnancy issues or complications, and so this using of an existing condition or an existing practice. So the idea of having these rich visual cloths, printed cloths, which actually came from the Dutch. It's not indigenous to Africa. But I found this a very smart project. And then another example I showed them are the arpillera from Chile. And under Pinochet, when all of the assassinations were happening and people were disappearing, Catholic Charities worked with village women. The media was totally shut down. Nobody knew what was going on. And the Catholic Charities worked with these village women who already had a tradition of making story cloths. And they were usually of cute little village scenes and everything was happy. And they got the women to start putting the atrocities into the textiles. And there already was an international market for these in the tourism market. So this was one of the most important ways that news of what was going on there got out of the country. So you can see that, the killing of women, the throwing of people in the wells, the imprisonment, the disappeared. This was going on in Argentina and Chile at the same time, but it was Chile that had this arpillera tradition. And then one of Adam and Seth's colleagues at Brown works on these, Lena Giuseppe. And these are the singing scroll painters from West Bengal. And this is, they are now putting things like 9/11, the tsunami, they're putting disasters into their story cloths. And so it's a visual and a sung way of transferring information. And then the last example before I get to ours was a group in Gujarat that worked in the desert with, in Kutch,